In every long-running power struggle, there always comes a point where hesitation stops being an option. When both sides have pushed, pulled, and tested each other for so long, eventually someone makes a move that either resets the entire game or collapses it completely. In this case, that moment came when Camilla made what insiders describe as her final calculated decision in response to William's tightening pressure inside the royal structure. For weeks leading up to it, tensions inside the palace had already been building in a way that those close to the situation say was impossible to ignore. William's position, authority, and influence had been steadily increasing, and with that came a quiet but unmistakable reshaping of how things were being handled around Camilla. What she saw as a slow dismantling of her standing, she interpreted not as coincidence, but as intention, and so she decided to act. Those familiar with the situation describe her decision as carefully thought out, not impulsive. Camilla reportedly believed she still had one remaining advantage that could shift perception in her favor. It wasn't force, it wasn't authority, and it wasn't access. It was something far more delicate and, in royal dynamics, often far more powerful: public sympathy. The idea was simple in theory. If she could reframe what was happening inside the palace as unfair treatment rather than structured accountability, then public opinion might begin to lean in her direction. And if that shift was strong enough, it could create enough pressure to slow William's momentum, or at least force a pause in what she reportedly viewed as a systematic tightening of control around her position. But what looked strategic on paper did not translate the same way in reality. According to multiple accounts circulating within royal commentary circles, the move did not generate the reaction she expected. Instead, it triggered a response that was far more complicated and ultimately far more damaging to her standing than the situation she was trying to correct. To understand why this mattered so much, it's important to understand what Camilla believed she was working with. Despite years of public scrutiny, controversy, and shifting perception, she had managed to rebuild a version of her image that was far more stable than it once was. Over time, she transitioned from one of the most heavily criticized figures in royal history into a more settled institutional role. Not universally adored, but widely accepted in a way that once would have seemed unlikely. That perception mattered, because in her view, it meant the public had already softened toward her. She wasn't starting from zero anymore. She wasn't facing the same level of resistance she had in earlier decades. She believed that residual goodwill, or at least neutrality, could be activated if the narrative was framed correctly. The problem was that the environment around the royal family had changed. Public engagement with royal developments was no longer shaped only by traditional messaging or carefully controlled reporting. Instead, it was shaped by a constant stream of detailed analysis, competing perspectives, and rapidly spreading interpretations of events inside the palace. And in that environment, narratives don't stay one-sided for long. Camilla's reported strategy involved reaching out through indirect and carefully managed communication channels. Not public statements and not direct confrontation, but intermediary messaging that would filter into commentary spaces already familiar with her perspective. Over the years, there had been commentators and journalists who were seen as more sympathetic to her side of the royal story, and those channels were reportedly where her concerns were expressed. The message as it circulated through these layers was essentially a version of grievance framed as imbalance. According to those familiar with the narrative being pushed, she believed she was being portrayed unfairly within internal palace dynamics, and that William's actions were not being interpreted with the context she felt they deserved. In simpler terms, she was trying to reposition herself not as a resistant figure inside a changing structure, but as someone being unfairly targeted by it. But instead of stabilizing her position, the move had the opposite effect. Public reaction, according to those tracking royal sentiment closely, did not align with the sympathy-driven outcome she had anticipated. One major reason for that shift was timing. Over recent months, discussions surrounding the royal family had already been saturated with long-standing references to past controversies, especially those involving Princess Diana and the historical tensions that continue to shape public perception of the monarchy. As a result, when new narratives emerged suggesting unfair treatment of Camilla, many people did not interpret them in isolation. Instead, they were filtered through a much longer and more emotionally charged historical context. That context, fairly or not, reshaped how the message was received. What Camilla may have intended as a controlled image correction instead reopened conversations that were already deeply sensitive for large sections of the public. And once that happened, the narrative became significantly harder to manage. Inside the palace itself, the reaction was even more consequential. William, William, according to those familiar with his approach, did not respond with immediate public confrontation or emotional escalation. Instead, his response was described as measured, quiet, and unsurprised. Those close to the situation suggest that he had anticipated some form of pushback and had already accounted for it in his broader understanding of internal dynamics. When the intermediary messaging reached him through established channels, it reportedly confirmed what he had already suspected, that attempts were being made to shape external perception in response to internal changes. And rather than destabilizing his position, it actually reinforced his understanding of the situation. Because in structured institutions like the monarchy, perception is only one layer of influence. Documentation, consistency, and long-term institutional memory often matter far more. And from William's perspective, this wasn't about reacting to narrative shifts. It was about observing patterns. Those patterns, once recognized, are not easily erased. As the situation developed, commentary around the royal family began to split more visibly. Some narratives attempted to present Camilla's position as one of institutional pressure and personal frustration. Others countered that the broader context of royal history made such interpretations far more complicated than they first appeared. What became clear very quickly was that instead of producing clarity, the move had created a wider and more fragmented conversation about loyalty, legacy, and authority within the royal structure. Within palace-adjacent circles, the reaction was described as increasingly cautious. Advisors, commentators, and institutional observers began to reassess not just the immediate situation, but what it signaled about future interactions between senior members of the royal family. Even King Charles, according to those familiar with internal sentiment, was said to be navigating the situation in a more reserved and private way, aware that tensions of this nature rarely remain contained for long. But the most significant shift came in how the narrative itself evolved after the move. Instead of reinforcing Camilla's intended message, the situation began generating more scrutiny around the methods used to communicate it. The use of intermediaries, the timing of the messaging, and the attempt to shape perception through indirect channels all became part of the discussion. And once that layer was introduced, the focus shifted away from sympathy and towards strategy. That shift is often where carefully constructed image control begins to lose stability. Because once the public starts analyzing how a message is delivered rather than just what it says, the conversation changes completely. What makes this situation particularly complex is that it did not emerge from a single incident. It is the result of years of overlapping history, shifting alliances, and evolving roles within the royal framework. William's position has been growing steadily, and with that growth comes a natural recalibration of influence across the institution. In environments like this, transitions are rarely smooth, even when they are expected. Camilla, for her part, is described by observers as someone who has long understood the importance of perception management. Her entire public evolution has been shaped by careful image rebuilding over decades. From a highly controversial figure to a more stabilized and accepted royal presence, her journey has often been cited as one of the most significant rehabilitation narratives in modern royal history. But even long-established strategies have limits. And in this case, those limits appear to have been reached. As things stand, the move that was intended to reinforce her position instead exposed the fragility of relying on public sentiment as a stabilizing force in a system that is increasingly defined by internal structure rather than external approval. William's response, steady and controlled, reinforced that shift rather than challenging it. And now, the entire situation sits in a far more exposed position than before it began. What happens next inside the royal family will likely depend not just on public reaction, but on how internal decisions are made moving forward in light of what this moment has revealed. Whether this becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a long-running internal tension remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. In a space where image, legacy, and authority are constantly competing forces, a single miscalculated move can change the entire direction of the conversation. And in this case, it already has.